Hello, this is Jen, the Liberty Lion. I want to talk today for a second about Maxine Waters. And this came out on Anthony Brian Logan's channel here on YouTube. Maxine Waters confronts homeless people and tells them to go home. Okay, now Maxine Waters is in California. She's a federal representative for the state of California and the people in her district. So Maxine Waters is supposed to be helping people find Section 8 housing, and apparently they issue some sort of vouchers or something, and so the people are there to get a voucher, but there weren't enough vouchers for everyone, so they're confronting her on their homelessness, and she tells them to go home, whereas Anthony Brian Logan says, well, they don't have a home, that's why they're there. So this is a good explanation or a good example that we can use on the federal state. So let's listen briefly to what he says here.
And I think that it's caused by an over-reliance on the government. If you're relying upon the government and you want them to help you all the time, and they say, okay, Section 8, you're going to be rushing like a mad dog to get these government benefits rather than trying to do something else for yourself. That's typically how it goes in places like Los Angeles, but we'll keep on going in the article.
So this brings me to the jurisdiction over federal areas within a state. This is a report done by a committee of people who was put together in 1951, I think, by President Eisenhower at the time. And this committee had done a study that took a couple of years for them to do, and they came out with 2 books. I talk about these reports, these 2 reports called Jurisdiction Over Federal Areas Within the States, in almost all of my videos. So even if it's not directly part of my videos, it's there's indirect reference to it most of the time. So what Maxine Waters is doing is she's basically using non-appropriated fund money, which is income for the government, through the titles not passed into law. So when you look up from the uscode.house.gov website, which is the Office of the Law Revision Council United States Code, and you put in Housing Authority, you get a couple of reorganizations planned, then you get 7 USC. 7 USC is under agriculture. It's not a positive law, meaning it's not a law, it's just a title. It's a title called Title 7, and everything in it is basically done by contract through a non-appropriated fund instrumentality. In other words, it's a middleman used to get money off of the private people outside of the federal area, because the federal government has no authority, no power, no jurisdiction off of lands that it purchased and outside of the jurisdiction on the lands that it purchased. Okay, I've been talking about that today in the 2 military officers manual videos that I did today, which is the 1st of April 2022. So this is all connected. So Anthony Brian Logan is talking about the state of California, and the state of California is the federally created state, but it's administering some benefits to private people in the state using contracts through their titles never passed into law because they're not constitutional. They're done as a contract through their instrumentalities, which are their instruments, which are their tools, or their middlemans, or the shadow government, the mafia government, the government instrumentalities, the military-industrial complex, etc., and so forth. So the only people in here that are, or the only law in here that does have housing through the Constitution is Title 10 and Title 14, maybe a few other titles, but Title 10 and Title 14 allow for the government to build housing for its military members on the military posts. That's the actual real constitutional federal housing authority. But when they use it for private people, in order for the representatives in Washington to gain favor with their constituents and gain votes for their non-law Title II, not passed into law position that they're fighting for in Congress up at the seat of government, they have to have some sort of incentive to get people to go to the polls and vote for them. Originally, these instrumentalities were created to help aid the government in building things on the federal lands for the federal people who were not private citizens. And being not private citizens, they were not in the original state, they were in the federal state. So if you have Texas, you have inside Texas, you have the federal areas, and then you have the non-federal areas, which are the state belonging to the private people of the state. So you have state people and then you have federal people. Originally, the federal people stayed on federal lands and they paid federal taxes and they had federal benefits. The state people built their own stuff off the federal lands inside the state of Texas, which is not the state of Texas, the Republic of Texas. Okay, so the private people had their state, the Republic of Texas, which still exists according to Texas Jurisprudence, 3rd edition, the manuals that the judges, lawyers, and attorneys used for court cases. Under statehood, it says under Section 1 that the Republic of Texas still exists, and it only cedes jurisdiction as far as bringing into effect the federal Constitution, which should only really affect the people on the federal lands, which is the federal state, which is the state of Texas, which is a public federal state. Okay, so those people on those lands, they didn't have some things. They didn't have schools, they didn't have housing, they didn't have hospitals, they didn't have cemeteries, etc., and so forth. And so the federal government had to provide for those things. And they did so by creating these instruments which allowed them to act outside of the Constitution. Well, these instruments became just titles, but they couldn't pass the title into law because they're not constitutional. So aliens and nationality, the way the federal government runs it, is not constitutional. Agriculture is not constitutional the way they run it from the federal government. Banks and banking, this was probably the start of how they went about getting these things done. And part of that was through the IRS, the Department of Treasury. The problem is under Title 26, which is not a positive law, which means it's not a law, it's just a contract, and that's why they have you sign papers with them, the W-4, whatever those papers are, that they have you sign to pay taxes or elect to pay taxes because it is an election, which means it's voluntary, which means it's by contract, which means it's not under a law, it's by contract. And so when a judge sits on a case for Title 26, he's not sitting in his constitutional office, he's sitting in a contractual office. So let's see what the jurisdiction over federal areas within the state says. So this is why I really love Eisenhower, because he made sure that this information got out, and it's been out since the 1950s. The instant study was occasioned by the denial of a group of children of federal employees residing on the grounds of a Veterans Administration hospital of the opportunity of attending public schools in the town in which the hospital was located. So there was a Veterans Hospital, which is a federal entity on federal lands with some jurisdiction, and jurisdiction is power and authority, ceded to the federal government by the states. So the states really are over and sovereign to the federal government, except for the things when they cede those things, those powers, those authorities to the federal government to do certain things on those lands, because the ultimate power comes from the state, which is us, the common people in the state. We are not federal people. Okay, so they wanted to be able to send their kids to school, and the state said no, because they pay their own taxes, they pay their own federal taxes, and the state people pay their own state taxes. And they don't mix. So the federal government was supposed to build its own things on the federal lands, and then the state was supposed to have its own things on its lands. So an administrative decision against the children was affirmed. So no, the federal children cannot come into the state, into the town where the hospital was located, off the federal lands, to go to state schools, state public schools, because those schools were built by the people of the state, not the federal government. So the children affirmed that local courts, finally including the Supreme Court of the state, the decisions were based on the ground that residents of the area on which the hospital was located were not residents of the state. Okay, so they were originally, according to the original Constitution. Let's look at Republic of Texas, Texas, and State of Texas. Texas is all the lands. If you look at a map of Texas, it just says Texas. Now, the people of the territory of Texas got together and they created a state and they called it the Republic of Texas. Now, the federal government came along and said, well, we'd like a piece of that. And then we want to run your military. Well, Texas already had a military that was, I think, bigger than what the federal government had at that point. And Texas was like, nah, I don't think so. But of course, as the federal government does, it's like, we want that power. We want that power. So they just kept nodding and notching at their chest. And then finally Texas says, well, all right, we'll join, but we're retaining all of our rights. We retain the right to secede from this union at any point in time that we choose. And federal government was like, okay, well, as long as you're in, you're just in. Now they try to twist it around and say, well, once you're in, you can't leave, but that's not true. So the people on the federal lands who wanted to go off the federal lands and send their kids to the school were not allowed to because they didn't pay state taxes. They weren't residents of the state. They were on an island in the state, or an enclave, or a post, or a fort, or an area, or a federal land, or a military post, or a military reservation, or a military base, an installation, a military installation. They have a million names for these places, but what it all boils down to is that these were lands purchased by the federal government to build posts. Okay? So when they live on that post, they are federal people. They're like on an island in a state. And all these little islands inside the original state, like inside the Republic of Texas, they created among themselves their own state. So these people who want housing benefits from the federal government are confused between whether they live in the Republic of California, the state of California, or the territory of California. So let's look at the Constitution. I'm not going to bring it up, but it says if you want to run for office, you have to be so many years a citizen of the United States and not an inhabitant of the state. So you could not be a resident of the state. You had to already be on the federal lands before you could even run for federal office at the seat of government. And the federal government then had exclusive legislative jurisdiction over the federal areas. Okay, so over such area had been ceded by the state to the federal government. So they'd ceded the land to build the post, but they also ceded their right to make law for the post, giving the right to make the laws to the federal government. And this is where people get confused because they start thinking that they're in the federal state because it's been pushed on us and pushed on us and pushed on us. And then people go in and they say, well, I want some of those benefits and I want to have a Section 8 housing and I want to have welfare benefits and I want to have free food and I want to have a cell phone and I want money for a car and whatever else they give to you. And then they tell you on top of that, you have to pay federal taxes, but you don't belong to the federal state. So why do you have to pay federal taxes? Because you don't, and it's not in the Constitution. But they want your money and they want you to be able to give them your money. So they create Title 26, but it's never passed into law because it's unconstitutional. Instead, they get their instrumentalities to push it on you for them, a middleman, the mafia. Okay, you've got the guy who runs everything in the mafia, and then you got his goons who go out and, threaten people. That's what these instrumentalities are. It's like the mafia. They create these institutions, these instrumentalities like the banks, bank and banking, and then they get under banking, they pay, like, the people who work for Commerce and Trade, or the fake IRS, the Internal Revenue Code, Title 26, to go out and tell you, well, you have to sign this paper, you have to do this, and you have to pay us. If you don't, you're going to go to jail. Okay? All lies, all mafia bullshit. Okay? So the decisions were based on the ground that residents of the area on which the hospital was located were not residents of the state, since the state gave up the right, exclusive legislative jurisdiction, to the federal government. So states, since exclusive legislative jurisdiction over such area had been ceded by the Republic of Texas or the Republic of California or the Commonwealth of Virginia to the federal government. And therefore, they were not entitled to privileges of state residency. They weren't state residents. They were federal residents on the federal islands inside the state, ultimately creating a state for itself, but a dependent state, not an independent state. So then we talk about the state of Texas cannot secede from the Union. The Republic of Texas can, and it secedes from the Union simply by kicking out the state of Texas and say you can't be here anymore. So then they take back the lands that they sold to the federal government, if that's what they choose to do. Okay, in an ensuing study of the state Supreme Court decision with a view toward applying to the Supreme Court of the United States. So these people got pissed off and they're like, no, we want to send our kids to the state public schools. And if you don't let us, then we're going to file a case in the United States Supreme Court. It's not spelled this way in the Constitution. It's got a lowercase s, which means it's not actually the Supreme Court. It's the lower Supreme Court because it's lower to the states. The state's Supreme Court is higher than the federal Supreme Court because the states, the original states, such as Republic of Texas, joined the Union and created the federal government in its state. Okay, so they applied to the Supreme Court of the United States for a writ of certiorari. The Department of Justice ascertained that state laws and practices relating to the subject of federal legislative jurisdiction are very different in different states because each state retains some jurisdiction over the federal lands. Some states gave up all the jurisdiction over the federal lands. And then some states, they gave up all of it, they gave up some of it, or they had to give up some of it. So some states had kept some jurisdiction and some states didn't keep any jurisdiction. And then some states kept some types of jurisdiction and other states didn't keep those same types. They kept different types. Okay, so what does that mean? That means that in every state, the right of the state over the federal lands may look a little bit different. Some states may have wanted to keep the right to claim the natural resources on the federal lands. Some states, they just wanted to be able to serve subpoenas on the federal lands. Some states wanted to be able to go in and inspect the federal lands, just different things for different states. And then some states said, here's your federal land, we don't want anything to do with it. Okay, so that's what it means by federal right to make federal law on the lands given to the federal government from the states are different from one state to the next state. That practices of federal agencies with respect to the same subject vary extremely from agency to agency without apparent basis, and the federal government, the states, residents in federal areas, and others are all suffering serious disabilities and disadvantages because of a general lack of knowledge or understanding of the subject of federal legislative jurisdiction and its consequences. Okay, so the federal government only has power on federal lands. The extent of that power varies from state to state depending on what power the state kept and what power they didn't care to keep. So like I said, some states gave up all power over the federal lands. Some states gave up little power over the federal lands to the federal government, and some states gave up a medium amount of federal right or state rights over the federal lands. Okay, so it varies from state to state, but there's a general lack of understanding in that the federal government has no power off the federal lands. It's not in the Constitution. That's why they had to create these mafia men, these middlemen, shadow government, military industrial complex, corporations, instrumentalities, appropriated fund, non-appropriated fund, etc. Okay, so what do I mean by appropriated fund and non-appropriated fund? Okay, so Maxine Waters has to go and she has to fight for money to give to her constituents so that she can pay for them to have government housing. The problem is she's not fighting for this money, and this money comes from non-appropriated federal money. So when you pay your taxes through Title 26 because you're not a federal person and you don't owe a federal tax, but you agree by contract to pay for these taxes, what you're doing is you're putting money into a bank account for Maxine Waters to go and dip into to pay for housing for people who don't belong to the constitutional armed forces. Title 10, Title 14, okay? So let's look at that again real quick. So the federal people on the federal lands, they want some stuff from the state. The state says, no, you don't get our stuff because you don't live here and you don't pay taxes here. You live on the federal lands. You live on that island inside our state. You're lucky we even let you come on and off. Okay? They didn't like that. They took it to court. The state court said, yeah, well, screw you. You're wrong. You're not getting free education for your children because you're not state residents. You don't live in the state. You don't pay state taxes. You live on federal lands. You pay for federal taxes. If you want schools for your children, you go ask the federal government for them. And that's what they did. But the federal government had no way of providing for education to the federal people on the federal lands by way of the Constitution. So what they had to do was create a situation where they could try to get private people in the state to agree by contract to pay taxes voluntarily. Remember, they said taxes are voluntary. Taxes are voluntary. They said that many times. That's not me saying that. They've said that in Congress. Taxes are voluntary. You volunteer to pay taxes by signing the forms. The forms do not comply with the ideas of federalism, and neither do the titles. They're not passed into law. You're paying by agreement so that you can help provide schools for the people on the federal lands. But then people off the federal lands who didn't have access to that money, they're like, well, wait a minute, where's all the money going? Why aren't you providing me for schools? Because they didn't understand. They had a general lack of knowledge or understanding of the subject of federal legislative jurisdiction and its consequences, because everybody's looking at the federal government as the place it goes to get an advantage, the place it goes to get money, welfare assistance, housing. But it can only do that outside the Constitution using its middlemen, its mafia, okay? Because they're not passed into law, and so the money cannot be appropriated through the Constitutional Congress. The money to pay for the housing cannot be appropriated through the Constitutional Congress. That's called appropriated funds. When it's constitutional, it complies with the ideas of federalism, meaning it's constitutional. The Constitution gives the right for them to do it, and they're able to do it, and Congress passes the bill, which appropriates the money, sends the money to that thing according to the dictates of the Constitution. But they can't do that for housing for private people in the state because the Constitution doesn't allow it, because the Constitution only allows for the money to go to certain things, basically the military, the creation of the forts, arsenals, dockyards, necessary buildings. So these non-appropriated fund instrumentalities, for them to exist, they have to get money from somewhere. Where do they get it from? From the people of the state who don't owe them anything through these private contracts that you sign. The W-4 does not mention any kind of law on it. It only mentions Title 26 Internal Revenue Code, which is not a law. Okay, you can look and you can see what a law looks like, what a law citation looks like. It's in Title I because you see the asterisk here. That means it's been passed into law. I think it's under front matter. It'll say, here it is, positive law citation. Title I of the United States Code, entitled General Provisions, is codified and enacted into law. Positive law, and may be cited as 1 U.S.C. section, and whatever the section is. And this Title I has 1 to 213 are the sections. So instead of saying chapter such and such, part such and such, code, you just got to say 1 USC section 201. And that's how you cite an actual law. Publication and distribution of Code of Laws of the United States and Supplements, and District of Columbia Code and Supplements would be 1 USC 201, and that's how you cite a law. There is no law citation for Title 26 or the Department of Education. Where is it? You know where it is. You saw it here. Title 20. Intoxicating liquors is not a law. It's by contract on the federal lands, but they apply it off the federal lands also, and they send their agents, their federal agents, and their state of Texas agents, because you think that's your state, and it's not your state. Not if you're free, sovereign, and independent. And here's another thing. You register your property with Title 26 Internal Revenue Code. Your property sits in a federal address created for the purposes of siphoning money off of you. So if your property sits in state of Texas or state of California or state of Virginia, it's sitting in the federal state, and it belongs to the banks. So in order to change it, you have to request a change of situs from the state of Texas or state of Virginia or wherever to the Republic of California or Republic of Texas, wherever the territory is that the property sits. Like, you can't change from Republic of Texas to Republic of California. You have to be, if it's in Texas, it's in Texas. But you have to change the situs, because if you change the situs, you're no longer under Title 26 or any of the federal titles for the state of Texas. You're under the Republic of Texas. And then the education for the Republic of Texas will come under the people, the private people of the Republic of Texas, and not the federal government. So the federal government won't have anything to do with it. All these titles, without being passed into law, they're just methods of extortion for extorting money off of you to increase its power, increase its wealth, increase its mayhem around the world, as we see now. So I hope that you guys understand this, and I hope I've explained it well. and I hope that it's not too redundant for people. There's been a few people who've added themselves to this channel, who've subscribed, and so I wanted to go over some of this stuff periodically to make sure that everyone's included in getting a full understanding of what all this stuff means and where they need to be, what state they need to stand in, and who has power and who does not have power. And even though they say that the states have sovereignty, the sovereignty ultimately comes from the people who live in the state, not the federal government and not even the state. Okay, so here we have federal acquisition. So that's the purchase. The acquisition is the purchase of legislative jurisdiction over such areas has made of them federal islands within states, which the term enclaves is frequently used to describe. In the Constitution, it is the lands or areas, or as they say here, the seat of government, 10 miles square as may become the seat of government, and places, it's not acquired in the Constitution, it's purchased for the erection of forts, arsenals, magazines, dockyards. So you can either live in the federal state, which is the state of Texas, the state of California, the state of Oregon, the state of Washington, the state of Virginia, which is the federal state, or you can live and work in your original jurisdiction, which is your original state, which is Republic of Texas, Republic of California, Commonwealth of Virginia, Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, so on and so forth. Okay, so you want to be a resident of your original state, not the federal state. And that will make you free, sovereign, and independent. Okay, like, share, and subscribe. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to see what you have to say. I read all the comments that I get notified of, but not only is YouTube still deleting a lot of my comments I make on other people's pages, but they're not telling me when I have someone comment on my videos. Sometimes I just have to go through the videos and look and see if I've gotten any comments on videos, and then I check the videos and see. Sometimes I do get notifications, but a lot of times I notice that I don't, and I find comments that have been made a long time ago, and then I feel bad because I never let that person know that I acknowledged that they made a comment. So if you make a comment and I don't say anything, it's not because I don't, I'm ignoring you or anything. I just, sometimes I just don't get the notifications. Okay, so like, share, subscribe, and talk about this stuff with your friends and family and your children and your children's friends, and try to understand that your state and the federal government are separate entities, and that the state is actually supposed to, the original state, is supposed to control the federal government, which is the general government, the military government. The state is supposed to control them. And if your original state is not controlling the military state, which is the federal government, then I think that if anyone was going to do anything, that would be where we need to start. We need to start asking the governors what the hell they're doing, and why are they doing nothing, and why are they letting the federal government get away with this stuff. And I think once they realize that they have the support of the people, they will change their tunes and they will start practicing their authority over the federal government, which will contract the power of the federal government and put it back on its lands where it belongs. Okay, so go out and talk to people, and if you don't understand something, or you just have a comment, you think I missed something and you want to let me know so I can be sure to address that in my next videos, then please do so. I look forward to people commenting on my videos, even if you just say, hey, I don't like what you said. We can even talk about that. So I'll let you guys go. It's 34 minutes, not 35 minutes, and I'll see you in the next video.